I've been talking to a lot of people recently, and so I've been able to better articulate and present some of my ideas. And I now wish to make a recording of a sort of refinement of things that I have mentioned in my criticism of the American legal system, the recording on that. And then this also ties in quite heavily with the kind of content that I produced in response to Lord Sumption's Wreath lectures. Um, So I'm going to be picking out things from there. So sadly, most of this recording is going to be a rehash, but perhaps a bit of a refinement. So I hope I'll succeed in making a kind of a standalone argument. So the topic of this would be something like the best form of a legal structure, or something like that, or how to actually have a genuine republic. Because in some sense, I think that most even Western style systems are illegitimate in the kind of in achieving a libertarian uh, structure, and they are prone to what I call the Napoleonic corruption, in that when you de facto have a parliament or a congress or a legislative body that um, essentially promulgates the the moral authority in your society, that you have created a kind of nanny government, but in a way in which the citizen is denigrated in terms of their integrity as a moral agent, is diminu- there's a diminutive relationship there. Now, in some sense, just to out the gate say these things, although I'm not going to talk about religion and spirituality directly, there is, this Christian precept that somewhat doesn't require the state to mirror the high standard of, let's say, spiritual life, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But um, I just think that in terms of an ideal and an optimal, one could strive for a structure in society and civilization that, at its nexus, at its default operating structure, at least exalted the importance of the development of a moral discerning, or at least an internal locus of control, because the status of the citizen itself, in terms of within the structure of how governance is operated, uh, that the system reflects um, the value of, let's say, moral norms that society uh, uh, comes into some kind of consensus about, but also that that consensus can be challenged on the level of the individual, going up against whatever legal structures are brought to bear upon him, and that he can, or one can, he or she can uh, overturn and novate the law, because the law is an independent institution that is independently framed and promulgated. Um, Now, I know people are going to be saying, well, what are you even talking about? This is not possible. And let me tell you that it is possible. Because if you have the Roman law as a substantive base in your legal structure, the law can stand as an independent, codified system that can evolve all by itself, that it is in a sense perfect because it runs on general actions and principles. And those principles are a closed system, they're immutable, they've all been worked out from the philosophical geniuses. And yes, you do develop a jurisprudence, you do develop an idea about, well, we come up with legal tests that fulfill those principles, and then when we reach new controversies, someone stands up one day and says the legal test being applied to this criteria shouldn't not be applied to me, because I had something different in my mind going on at the time, and what I was thinking was far more sophisticated and responsible than what this test abjectly seeks to judge me against. And so the test is wrong. The test needs to be expanded or to broadened. And in some sense, my thinking is much clearer on this issue, and therefore the judge then is the judge is then required to discover the common law, and to adapt and to change and to novate the tests. But the principles, you see, the test and the principle are distinct things. And so the tests are developed and the principles are still closed and immutable and stay the same. So then you have an independent legal system. And you don't need, and in some sense, when the legislature tries to create new actions or new civil wrongs or new criminal wrongs, it is received by the substantive law, by the Roman substantive law, and say, okay, well, the legislature wants to do this. So what it wants to do is it wants to do something similar to what already exists within the Roman law, so that's how we'll treat it. Those are the principles that then will be applied to what the legislature is trying to do. And maybe the Roman substantive law will reject what the legislature is trying to do, if it's incompatible with its principles. And so you see, then morality becomes an independent program within the system of governance, within the system of government. And you have what I would say the only way to actually conduct a republic that belongs to its citizens. And let me just speak as well in reference to my legal system, which has the substantive Roman law, and also talk about the constitutional arrangement. So we also have an absolute constitution, or sorry, rather a supreme constitution, and its rights in the Bill of Rights are actually not absolute, because there is a limitations clause. Okay, I'm going to in a while come back to explaining how having a limitations clause on your Bill of Rights is by far preferable and the only way to do things properly. But let me talk about America's Bill of Rights, which are absolute rights. They are permanent guarantees. They cannot be limited. Now, this is a bit of a farce, because in practice they are interpreted so as they can be permanently protected. So they are interpreted as not being encroached on in some sense. So they end up de facto being limited anyway. And in some sense, the judiciary in the American system, the actual judge on the bench, as it were, is put in an intellectually inappropriate position that is, in some sense, anyway, I mean, in terms of the role that they have to fulfill, you end up perpetrating what I call the Napoleonic corruption. Okay, let me just explore this. So, essentially what ends up happening is that the judge has to weigh the preservation of the legislative fiat against any absolute rights that the individual supposedly has. And there is an incentive, or even a perverse incentive, in order to supposedly preserve both. The legislative fiat that is tempered by these absolute rights. And so if a rationalization exists to save the legislative fiat, or to give effect to the legislative will in a way that can be read as being consonant with the right, then the law adapts in that direction. and so essentially the individual has no substantive grounds because there aren't broader principles. The principles are the current jurisprudence, and then essentially the more invention and the more, let's say, fiat that the legislature sort of ends up developing, that's the only thing that you are relativistically uh, contextualizing these absolute rights with. Um, Now, I understand that, textualists and originalists um, have a bit of a bulwark against this, but you do have a problem is that you don't have principles that are iterated, and you do have such a thing as uh, because you're not conserving principles and iterated values, you have to kind of imagine this original intention in the document. And uh, you know, you might say, well, it might be, let's say, incomplete in the modern context, that you can sort of extrapolate some kind of libertarian ethos um, that then has to be grounded within a later modern environment, uh, which in some sense could not be anticipated necessarily, but then you have to reimagine the ethos in this new context. And essentially, because this is not iterated as principles and values, um, you have much too blunt and sharp. Um, you can't say that the Bill of Rights themselves are principles and values. Um, but in essence, that is how the judge is forced to treat them. Um, and so they end up being very wishy-washy. If there was a jurisprudence that there was like a general limitations clause, then they would start to render, bones and flesh and sinew in a metaphorical sense, that they would start to be able to have a real strength and rigor and structure that would come out in the legal um, uh, the legal system would cash out those that situation um, in quite a robust jurisprudence, but instead, um, it's almost like the diviner's crystal ball. It's a bit strange. And in some sense, I mean, look, it's not as if the American system doesn't have its charm, but in some sense, everything is weighted then towards the political arena. Because if you, at the end of the day, think that your constitutional rights are being infringed, then essentially the idea is that, well, you need to make sure that your legislature reflects your moral values. So in some sense, the only protection you have against the infringement of your constitutional rights is to use it as a kind of political rhetoric to vote for people that are willing to conserve them from the legislative side of the equation. You're not really going to get real protection from the judicial side of the equation, except if it's kind of going to be an accident if you manage. Let me just give you a bit of a basic idea, just to show you just how to put this, how farcical the whole sort of system is that you have a right to pursue happiness, right? Um, can you use your right to pursue happiness to not pay your income tax? So just imagine just how meaningless such a right is. How vague and nebulous and utterly, in the end, useless and unreliable. Um, because essentially you're up against a mountain of rationalizations, and as long as a rationalization can be found in order to support and buttress the legislative fiat, it's basically it's ad hoc, arbitrary. Uh, ra- uh, ra- uh, so you are at the mercy of essentially whatever rationalization that can be found. Um, anyway, sorry, I could be a bit more cogent about dealing with all these issues. Okay, so let me migrate back to how. So if you have a Bill of Rights that has a limitations clause, then you can make practical arguments when your rights are being infringed. So all rights can be limited, and I should actually read out the limitations clause in the South African Constitution because it is brilliant. And essentially, the important thing here is that when you are going up against the government for infringing your rights in the Bill of Rights, you can make practical arguments, because if they're infringing your rights in the Bill of Rights, it's only basically justifiable if they are trying to deliver somebody else's rights in the Bill of Rights, and it's somewhat necessary. Because if you can say, well, yes, the reason why you're limiting my rights is to give somebody else their right, but is there another way of doing that? Because if there is another way of doing that, then it's one of the functions of government to essentially manifest the rights in the Bill of Rights and deliver them to the citizen. Because that's what it means when you have a supreme constitution in this context. So the government is violating its own purposes if it is essentially doing something in such a way in which it is haphazardly depriving someone of their rights in the Bill of Rights. So you are put on equal ground with the government. The judge doesn't just have to come up with a rationalization as to how the government has a legitimate purpose. It's not enough for them to have a legitimate purpose in their in it's that legitimate purpose is actually then also tested and measured against uh, other ways of achieving the same purpose. Um, yeah, I'm butchering this slightly because I mean, if you actually just read the limitations clause, section 36, it sorts all of this out. Okay, so covered the Roman law. This is okay, and I'll just say as well that look, South Africa sadly is a very bad example of its own legal structure at the moment because of, I would generally say, political bad faith. That the actual people in the judiciary are what I would call ideologically corrupt, and they are heavily influenced by the rest of the world's legal systems, who they believe in some strange way is the same as our legal system, and our legal system is not the same as America or other so-called republics and democracies and things like that. So this toxic atmosphere of legal positivism, which I believe is somewhat correlated to what I would call the Napoleonic corruption, has infected the legal thinking in my country. So, I mean, call me a hypocrite or something like that, saying that I have the best legal structure in the world, but it's not being lived up to, or it's been abjectly betrayed. It's very sort of sad, but anyway, I think that this recording is still very important to say, because especially I think it is a component of the current crisis that the West is in. That in some sense, when a social justice warrior, for instance, goes to court and tries to enforce something, or feels insulted or something like that, they're just waiting for the tools for the legislator to give them more teeth, to put more bite in their bark. And in some sense, if any time things are ruled against them, in some sense, what they translate the judge as saying to them is that you don't have enough political power yet. You need to control the legislature, and then I'll do whatever you want. And that's a problem when morality itself does not have an independent, is not independent of the of the legislative fiat. You live in something that is potentially totalitarian. So the only thing that stops it from being totalitarian is that you have to, enough of the population has to be damn well sure that the people that they're voting for are not going to, and in some sense, the extreme version of this is Britain, because in some sense, Britain, the only thing that stops Britain from becoming a totalitarian state is that every time you send your parliamentarians to the House of Commons, that you have to trust them because they have the sovereign right to legislate anything. And so in some sense, they're quite in a bold-faced way, they say, yes, we have the political power to radically transform everything and anything. They have an absolute right to promulgate law. And in some sense, they can, in some sense, it's weird because de facto there is some independent strain within the judiciary, but it's which is somewhat, as part of this almost sort of, so it's very culturally based in some sense. So it's so in some sense you can't really knock it because it has succeeded, and they've made sure that their culture is responsible for regulating these things to some degree, and therefore they've kept their culture alive. And in some sense, America has kept their politics alive by making that the fulcrum. And South Africa, has made essentially the structure itself robust. And if history was kinder, perhaps, it's sad because we are the only essentially country that has this Roman substantive law in it, which is the core of our common law. Because the British, when they took over South Africa, they installed the common law, but the common law is essentially adaptable to the law that already exists in a place. And so our common law is grounded in Roman substantive law. And so it was actually, the British wouldn't remove it because it was actually superior to their own law. It's a big claim, but I would submit that it is in fact why they didn't change the substantive side. I mean, they did actually change the Roman procedural law, because the Roman procedural law is actually a bit of a mess, or at least it's certainly inferior to the British procedural law. But anyway, the substantive arm of the law is completely the Roman law. And we got it from the Dutch, and the Dutch don't even have it anymore because Napoleon replaced it all in continental Europe. Everything fell to the Napoleonic codes and things like that, because I guess they found that it was ironically people that supposedly hated how feudalism worked installed a legal system that I would say is commensurate with that kind of sort of the serfdom that is the kind of the cultural ethos within feudalism. Because in some sense I do think that the legal culture and what I call the Napoleonic corruption ends up spilling over into society, into culture. And although history is not kind to South Africa in terms of the development of our culture, I would actually posit that there is more resilience in South Africa to this kind of totalitarian creep, although it just so happens that the people who wield the political power are so morally bankrupt and essentially culturally bankrupt. You know, the kind of the moral picture that they live in is, and the conceptualization of society that they have, has abjectly betrayed the Constitution and constitutional values of non-racialism. For instance, you know, they have reinterpreted everything according to their Napoleonic but also racialist worldview. You know, but this is generally because also this new ideology of so-called anti-racism and things like that is a bit of a totalitarian ideology. I would call it proto-fascist, but it happens at the same time that when morality gets warped in the way that it is being warped in general society, even across the West, because of this onslaught from this anti-normative morality sort of ideology, it happens at the same time that a version of democracy and legal positivism in which the legislative fiat becomes, let's say, begged to create a kind of a moral infantilism of the citizenry. People don't want to be accountable for, let's say, the quality of their governance. They just want to be delivered certain outcomes. They want to be respected and infantilized as an identity, no longer, let's say, sovereign individuals that are accountable for the rule, the quality of governance that they have. They just want nice things, essentially, without the responsibility. They want to be delivered a pride without having to kind of, a pride in their identity, and they want a state that kind of infantilizes that. Anyway, and this is, you know, also centered in a kind of in a toxic moral picture in which you've got a scapegoat or something like that. But anyway, this is a complete tangent. But these are, I mentioned these themes because they're somewhat part of what's going on in culture, and obviously South Africa, because of historical reasons, are more susceptible and prone to these kinds of toxic ways of thinking because they're so politically convenient, because they allow for a kind of moral unaccountability, because they have this toxic morality that lets them off the hook for their political decision making. So they're no longer accountable for their own failed policy because they've got a worldview that scapegoats the blame. So I would say for kind of political, for the reasons of political convenience, you know, this is kind of accelerated. I mean, in some sense, this is what happened in the 1920s in Weimar Germany, that, you know, even in America, there was a resonance with Hitler and you know, with the idea of, yes, we must give sympathy to people, and, you know, everyone. Hitler was the most popular political leader in Europe before the war. People forget this. And in the same way, I would say that South Africa is the new Weimar Germany, and we are perhaps seeing history repeat itself. Although, you know, I mean, there's certainly political actors who are very stringently designing. I mean, they have literally read Mein. I don't believe that the leader of the EFF has not read Mein Kampf and is not using it as an instruction manual. I believe that he is. That is what he has done, and that is what he is doing. It's very, very obvious. I mean, the kind of way that he is agitating towards some kind of anarchy so that he can stage a coup, essentially, which he has openly spoken about a coup. He's openly spoken about genocide. He tries to inflame the kind of the racial component of politics in a very overtly fascistic way. It's quite obvious that is his design and his plan, and I guess he sees that as his route towards power. That if the government were to, let's say, openly adopt open fascism rather than this subtle form of giving a nod to this kind of racial politics, which allows the pressure to be relieved for all the kind of political failure. Then you've kind of got a recipe for a never-ending plutocracy, but also then perhaps he can find his way back into the corridors of power, the leader of this very radical party, which I would say ideologically is quite similar to a large contingent of the ruling party, but essentially the ruling party doesn't really have an ideology anymore. They are just essentially mafioso kleptocrats. They just use the state cynically to extract and loot. And in some sense, the failings of their own policy allow them to justify more overreach and more concentrated radical intervention and control over things as they turn up the rhetoric that scapegoats and diverts blame for their mismanagement and corruption. Which is also to do with the moral corruption in the policy itself. But anyway, okay, yeah, I'm talking about South African politics, but essentially, it's sad because South Africa could actually stand as a model for the world in terms of its legal structure. A huge upgrade in the West, I think. It will be sad if, when essentially perhaps the whole society collapses and the civilization somewhat fails, that it might be lost because it is the only surviving, I would say, bastion of substantive Roman law. But essentially, South Africa should not be blamed on the grounds of its that there was a defect in its legal system. There was a defect in in its faithless or bad actorship of all I can say is that when things do go badly and they seem that they will continue to reach the point at which things will start to break down, that that certain people are held to account for the academics that were on this bandwagon that undermined the Constitution, the journalists, the activist journalists. That I imagine their excuse will be, well, it was a popular, fashionable intellectualism. Who were we to know that it was morally bankrupt? Because it operates as a kind of is quite a pernicious groupthink. But anyway, I've got my other recordings where I speak about this, and I do think that there is certainly no excuse, especially in the South African context, because we actually had a supreme constitution that has been betrayed, and these values have been undermined by even the Chief Justice himself, who makes these disgusting ideological racialist speeches. These are people that, when if things do go horribly sideways, these are the people that should, I'm envisioning something like a Nuremberg trial, and I do think that is important that to talk about this, because there is especially no excuse in the South African context. And now they blithely talk about amending and changing the constitution with their disgusting sort of legal positivism, with that kind of that sort of fascistic idea that, well, we just make the law. Anyway, there's a further argument as to actually why no change has ever been made to the Constitution. Changes have been made to an act of Parliament that supposedly contains the Constitution or iterates it, but that isn't actually the Constitution. The Constitution became a law promulgated by Parliament, but it existed before it was a law promulgated by Parliament, and the Constitution was made by the Constitutional Assembly. It was not made by Parliament. And in some sense, every amendment that has ever been made to the Constitution must be read in terms of elaborating the original formation of the document. Anyway, that's I'm not going to go into that, but that's it's a sort of an esoteric tangent. But in some sense, the Constitution has never been changed. It has been given greater effect in some sense. In some sense, I think all the amendments to the Constitution have been somewhat like secondary. It's been the same as creating secondary legislation. Secondary legislation is a term we created in South Africa to say that it is legislation that is seen as more important than other forms of legislation because it is seen as giving effect to the Constitution, so it has a higher status. And I would say that all amendments to the Constitution take on that form. That the Constitution has never changed. It has, in some sense, only been elaborated from the perspective of the legislature so that they can sort of conform to some kind of self-consistency. But I would argue that when an individual is going to court, the rights that they stand on and the form of the Constitution that they depend on and rely on is that promulgated by the Constitutional Assembly and not by Parliament. Anyway, again, that's an esoteric argument, but okay, let me just stop this recording. I kind of dealt with what I wanted to deal with, and then I had to clean up this issue about the example of South Africa. So I just wanted to put that into context. Did I cover everything that I said I would? Yeah, I mean, I could still probably explain this in a much more sort of cogent way, but almost the only new thing that I have added here is that how important it is to not have the Napoleonic corruption, in my view, in order to have a legitimate republic. That I think that in some sense you don't have a republic when you have denigrated the citizen into being diminutive under the moral authority. And in some sense this depletes, in some sense then morality becomes a moot point, because essentially you just expect the government to install the guardrails in your life and the moral guardrails, and government must chase after you. I know this is connected to a more general thing about having a libertarian ethos that is conserved within culture. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point to the legal issue. I felt like making this addendum because it's a slightly different topic, but it is conceptually, let's say, connected. I mean, if I'm going to talk about ideal legal structures, I might as well expand and go into talking about what I would consider as a way to structure a societal morality and ethos or something like that in some sense in the right place for politics, and talk about let's say doom spirals. Like, I mean, in some sense this is a further critique of sort of the SJW anti-normative morality sort of narrative and ideology and worldview, which in my sense does end up creating a different kind of individual, or it creates a different kind of person that becomes attached to a groupthink and puts people into almost a neo-feudalism in some sense. It's just a kind of did I make a recording about this? I have mentioned this before, but essentially, I think science and feudalism are just new cultural manifestations of the same thing, that people want to ground themselves in an objective morality so that they don't have to develop an internal locus of control and develop a normative value system. And essentially then they never enter into their ego, and they just languish in a kind of reactive projection of their emotions onto their environment, which is supported by the backdrop and the anchor of the subjective morality, which is grounded in some kind of symbol of an external locus of control, which is now done by kind of scientism and the belief in temporal determinism. And before, it was centered around the political power of the sovereign, which was almost like the divine right of kings. So it was often connected to some kind of religious narrative, perhaps as well. But it's interesting that, for example, when the Scottish peasants were dispossessed, these are people that didn't lose their religion, but they lost their nationality, and that was a harsher loss to them, because the narrative in which they lived, in which they could imagine that everyone was subject to the same um, objective morality, which was imposed and conditioned and built into the environment as an objective feature, that allowed them to believe that their experience was a kind of was homogenized into this medium and this fabric which they located themselves within, and that they didn't actually have to endorse from any kind of epistemic responsibilism from within themselves. That essentially they never constructed a real normative moral system. Although, there are ways in which perhaps feudalism, you could argue, especially the idea of Catholicism, did have positive effects in terms of inculcating and promoting normative values, because under the even subjugation to essentially doctrinal Catholicism or whatever, that meant that you couldn't get local power spheres and cultural bubbles that were, I mean, you did. I mean, you still can't completely avoid this, but that essentially Catholicism was a structured, systematic ultra bully that destroyed all the little bullies, and essentially in systemizing the kind of the narrative bullying that is applied to the individual, that then you realize that the people who have local power to you are also subjugated by the same yoke of the narrative, and in some sense it allows you to kind of take that subjugation for granted, and then have a kind of a separate domain of let's say, morality and philosophy maybe becomes a bit frivolous, but it's I don't know how to describe this now, but it becomes at least immune to being corrupted or seized by some kind of local folklore, or some kind of local superstitiousness, or the local witch or something like that, or a kind of or an ad hoc narrative that is being spun in some kind of so essentially the pervasive Catholic narrative at least grows but more benign in how it has to reconcile itself systematically, that that it has some checks and balances against its own excesses, which then frees up the individual in a local. So in some sense, I think that normative morality was a fruit of feudalism in some sense, but that doesn't mean that I can't still, let's say, in an ideal sense, criticize it. But anyway, this is this is almost a historical argument. Let me just move on. So I think now to kind of to let's say to seize on the opportunity which eventually feudalism and Christianity and Catholicism has delivered to us, in the history of the West and the progress that has been made and such, now requires us to be conscious of certain things like normative morality and to inculcate it into the culture and to safeguard it in the culture. Um, anyway, so what I want to talk about is something completely. So I don't want to venture off into that tangent or that side thing, but essentially, but a deeper contextualization of that, because I don't want to discuss my personal beliefs. I want to discuss the structure and the system that needs to exist in order to allow for enough autonomy in the individual to access, let's say, um, robust development, and let's say, and potentially access a spiritual life as well. So essentially, I want, but to ground my project in more secular terms, I want to describe the system that promotes the development of normative ethics and normative values, but is not a normative value system. So that's what I want to discuss. It's something like how to have a system, how to implement a structure, which is not itself the the demand of people to develop normative values, but facilitates the development of normative values in the organic manifestation or sort of within the context that is created by such a structure. So I I talk about things which in some sense they're not. So I talk about, so these are almost like heuristics. So these are like heuristics, which I have always politically endorsed. This is why it's interesting. Like Jonathan Haidt once, I can't remember what it's called. His moral theory. It's called formational morality or something like that. I can't remember. I remember taking his test, and I couldn't. I almost wasn't represented in the test. It was like, you don't even have a result. You're like a sociopath or something. Like you don't fall anywhere on the spectrum because you've got an inconsistent profile and all these questions. And I take that to be a failing of the test itself and of the model itself, because essentially he's looking for superficial markers, because he's got essentially these very kind of symbolic sort of things, and it can't actually deal with a sophisticated understanding, like, because essentially the answers to the questions that I have are not the answer of my sentimentality, because I have all the good sentiments in some sense, but in terms of when you ask me a particular question, I'm going to give you my strategy. I'm going to give you my heuristic as to how morality gets protected. I'll give you an example of this. I believe that essentially the individual must be regarded as sacrosanct, as the autonomy of the individual needs to be preserved. Now, there are some problems with this. For example, you can't just say, well, how is the individual going to be exalted by the government or by the state and let's say respected properly? And in terms of generating the right culture of respect for the individual, there are paradoxes, as it were. The family is a huge paradox. In some sense, if you don't let the individual become a parent and have a right to be a parent and to autonomously provide parenting in the way that they choose to parent, then in some sense you're going to potentially create a doom spiral, which is in some sense already what is sort of happening, where essentially de facto the government becomes the parent for every individual in society, and then you kind of undermine and degrade and erode libertarianism and a kind of individual autonomy, because essentially everyone becomes molded by the state. So, in order to protect the autonomy in the individual, you somewhat have to say something like, and this is almost a heuristic, this is not a pure principle, that families have the right to be dysfunctional up to some threshold. We have to, and in some sense, then I don't have to provide some kind of moral authority and say, well, this is the, you know, um, you know, what counts as a suboptimal family. Well, it doesn't matter, because as long as some threshold isn't reached, I'm allowed to be vague about, I have a personal opinion about what might be optimal, about being what an optimal family unit, how it would operate and be constructed. But that is my personal opinion. That is not for me to encourage other people. Or I mean, it is for me to encourage other people if I mean, so I would make a separate recording about that, but this isn't the context of this. I'm talking about a structure or a system that should not be enforced by a structure or a system. I can persuade other people and convince other people that my views are correct or whatever, but that's a separate question. Um, anyway, so Uh, so the system, the structure must tolerate things. That doesn't mean that me as an individual, that my opinion must tolerate things, but it must tolerate things to the point at which that I can't invoke my opinion as the reason to disrupt other people's autonomy. Um, it's exactly like the sort of the Voltaire free speech thing. I will defend to the death your right to say things that I don't agree with. Kind of thing. Um, so okay, so what is the point of this? So anyway, so I'm saying that we need to understand the necessity of these kinds of heuristics in some sense in order to create a rationale, in order to create a balance that actually allows us to enjoy, let's say, or have our normative values protected and pursued on the individual level, so that we're free to do that and to be respected in doing so by the state. And we can also sort of expect the state to tolerate us and perhaps also to provide some protections against other. Um, I'm just thinking in terms of public utilities and things like that. But anyway, okay, so what's my point here? Yeah, so I mean, in some sense, I would say like I like the idea of almost a culture of life, as it were, but I think that we should grow a culture of life organically, and that in some sense, I mean, not talking about really abortion directly, but in some sense, people think that things are moral simply because they're legal, and we need to break that connection in order to actually, I think, get the ball rolling. In making spirituality more relevant or pertinent, as it were, but also to stop the kind of doom spiral. So in the same way that the state can't just always run after the individual and seek to sort of install safety rails and things like that, because that becomes like a never-ending thing that you can always demand that the state should have prevented some harm to people and should have acted prospectively all the time, and that sort of ends up having a more infantilized citizenry that takes less and less responsibility and essentially depletes self-determinism as a value, or as something that is actually developed because it's not needed. It becomes sort of sorry, I'm not going to pronounce this word properly, superfluous. It becomes um, extraneous and unnecessary. And in some sense, when people then demand security delivered to them by the state, it is security from some kind of idea that the state needs to be responsible for the citizenry. That is a slippery slope essentially. But and this is essentially, I think, this would be quashed if we did things like legalized all drugs and made it so that companies then would mass produce high quality recreational drugs, which would then, at that time, it would also have very many positive effects in that essentially you would completely remove organized crime. In fact, if you wanted to change the law in that direction, you would probably be assassinated by organized crime, because you would essentially be completely, I mean, a lot of things would perhaps improve because you would remove that kind of underworld money and things like that and violence. But essentially, then you would have to deal with a generation of children who could perhaps complain that, well, my mother was an addict, and because you made drugs more freely available, she was essentially a worse mother or something like that. I mean, you could make an argument almost both ways, because you could say because it was cheaper to feed the habit, she was able to, let's say, chemically kill herself faster, perhaps. So it's like, but perhaps it was easier to feed the habit, and so there was less malfeasance. There was perhaps less criminal, in terms of when people get desperate for drugs and then they steal things and they mug people, that essentially if you could afford a drug habit, sort of just living on the streets and begging, if that was enough to basically feed your habit, um, essentially there might be a reduction in some things. But in some sense, the point is that then we would have to organically develop, let's say, the resilience and let's say the cultural critical mass that, like, don't use these substances. These are bad substances. And we, like, so I think there is something to respecting the individual enough. And yes, it is true that some people, they have in some sense lost their free will. Uh, but this is the problem. If at some point you don't bootstrap a kind of uh, a dignity and a libertarian spirit about an individual, you end up essentially, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that when you denigrate the citizen and the individual and you infantilize them, that you end up essentially in the doom spiral. And so, in my sense, also, uh, culture itself and morality has been completely beleaguered by, let's say, the nanny government or the nanny state, but the moral authority which the legislature is expected to bring to bear over the society, I think has a corrosive effect. I've been outlining that. So anyway, this is how I see actually arriving at um, a culture of life, for instance. Um, I mean, I must say, I would not. I don't think abortions are a good thing. Just to get into that issue, I mean, I would tolerate essentially having a kind of 2.5 months or sort of two. I think that we should allow for abortions, and it should be quite early, um, only in some sense, but essentially perhaps with the other changes people would understand that just because it's legal it's not necessarily moral. But in some sense I also think that, again, it's a touchy issue. uh, but you could somewhat make a utilitarian claim about the quality of life, as it were, and the kind of compelling someone to raise a child which is unwanted as being perhaps that the right to life be connected with essentially also considerations of the quality of that life. But this is a kind of disgusting kind of horse trading. But anyway, the in some sense, I feel that this kind of I mean, one's personal opinion aside, this kind of compromise might need to be made in a secular society in which, which is not a theocracy, which essentially should should hope and expect people to cultivate their own moral sensibility about things, and to understand that legality is not a codification of morality. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm talking about these heuristics, these structures to be put in place, which are not themselves normative morality, but I think are helpful precursors to generating, let's say, a vibrant, um, empowered libertarian ethos, which has a capacity and a facility to search out and develop one's own normative morality. Okay, so there's that. And so, yeah, I do think at some point you have to then, for the same reason, sort of empower the family to, that is then tolerated and allowed to be dysfunctional up to some threshold. And, you know, maybe new models of parenting will come out or something like that, and then those people will hold themselves up as a model and try to convince other people. But at some point, if you want other people to do different things, you have to convince them, you have to speak to them, you have to negotiate with them, you have to work out how to be convincing to them. And maybe they're too big-headed and they're not interested, and they want to go their own way. This is the human condition. You can't just impose uh, inverted commas the right way onto others. And in some sense, I think that this is the sort of the maximization that one can hope for. That you cannot expect. Uh, I mean, I don't see a. I think I've been watching some Paul Vanderklay stuff, and it's interesting because there's so many ideas that I resonate so much with. But to say kindness, that to be kind in the form that everyone is going to uh, that somehow everyone that if you had the right ideology, that everyone would sign up to it. I don't believe in that, essentially. And there is a toxic kind of kindness that has this idea that we just need to install the perfect ideology into the state. I think is sort of right at the outset. um, it is seriously antithetical to libertarianism, essentially. Um, anyway, I guess that's all I have to kind of say about that.